Mark Goering. We explore the head, the heart, the hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. And today I am going to interview Dave a little bit on a subject that, he brought up in a podcast for a long time listeners, several years ago, that he calls urban rebar, which I'm going to just share briefly, Dave, and then I want to have you talk about why you called it that. But we both live in cities, different size cities, but cities and urban centers, and it's really complicated to learn what does it look like to use our intro to make and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches across a place like this. And so we've got to learn how to cut through all of the barriers and the challenges to see that happen. And one of the ways that we see urban rebar happen is through the role of business. So I want to specifically ask Dave about how he sees business do that today. But first, Dave, when you use that term of urban rebar, can you unpack why we need that in urban centers like you and I live in?
Yeah. Well, whenever you look at rebar, Mark, it's just a whole bunch of small wires that are looped together, and then they just braid them up, twist them together. Um, and so some rebar that you put in concrete is solid, but whenever you look at like the lines and cables and things like that, it's that concept. We've got a lot of lines and cables that are running up and down. They get twisted together. And the way I look at a city is because we spent about 5 years focusing on unreached people groups in Oklahoma City primarily while we were working and doing our job. And then about 3 years ago, we made the switch to live, work, play, where we were focusing primarily on people who were in the marketplace. And when you put those two together, this concept came out where you've got people groups and you've got segments of your cities that are very much traditional missions kind of way of thinking. And they're running up and down our society, right?
Right,
And so let's take, for instance, Oklahoma City. We have Persians. We have a lot of Persians, Iranians who live here.
right,
And in the Iranian thread, if you will, inside the rebar, you're going to have some Iranians that are business owners and are quite wealthy. And then we've got some that are families that are struggling to make ends meet and may even be below the poverty line. And so you've got all kinds of economic and educational development all up and down, but they all come together, and you'll see them in either an Iranian church, or you'll see them in a mosque, or you'll see them at particular cafes. But they're going to get together because they're Persian, regardless of what their social status is. But
right,
what we find is that the vast majority of their time isn't spent there. Their vast majority of the time is in their cross section. And so businesses run across the cross section. And so let's say if you're in an upper class group, you may be in a professional organization. If I slice across cardiologist at OU Medical, University of Oklahoma Medical Center, if I
right.
slice across that, I'm going to find a lot of South Asians who still have a South Asian accent that moved here, were educated, and are now working in the United States and are going to be here long term.
Yeah,
But they're going to be working right alongside some people who were born in America, raised in America. They might be working next to a Pakistani. They might be working next to, and so all of a sudden, what we find is that the workplace has a way of cutting right across all of the unreached peoples and the ways in which communities get together ethnically or maybe religiously. The workplace cuts across all of them, and all of a sudden you have access points that can run up and down that community in a way that just trying to go after the community itself may not create space for.
thank you for giving some vision to that. We wanted to bring up this subject today. Dave did a great job just laying that out because as we engage in places like Oklahoma City, like New York City, like city urban environments, the one of the topics that we talked about even in our last podcast, Dave, was access. How do you begin to see access into these different pockets where there's loss? We need to get the gospel to every people and place. And the reason why we're talking about this today on this podcast around the topic of business is the ways that we've thought about that just are not getting the job done. And even our strategy of inviting people to a Sunday morning gathering just is not getting the job done. And so, what you're sharing there in the workplace and the way that that cuts across these different segments and it introduces access for people that otherwise wouldn't have it is a needed contribution, right, to the conversation around missions, that business can provide that. And so part of what we want to do in just this conversation is to, for those that haven't thought about business in that way, begin to just give some new insight and see business as access, right?
Yeah. And so I'll say, let's say you've got someone in the community that's pastoring a church, and you have a pastor in a church, he's extremely mission minded. So he wants to lead the church to be extremely mission minded. And so they look and they say, hey, we've got three unreached peoples in our group that no gospel community is in. There's no church, there's no gospel presence, there's no gospel being shared. We want to engage them. The a way that most of us would go through that is that we're going to put that in the ministry missions category, and we're going to think of it entirely in a traditional mission
Right,
sense. And so the
right,
way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the acronym EARLPEG, which we've done in our 5T training we talked about a long time ago, where we're going to say there's an urban center, there's a religion. We're going to EARLPEG, URLPEG. And so we're going to say there's an urban center, there's a religion. Within that religion, there's a language. Within that language, there's a people group. Then there's an evangelistic status on are they reached or unreached. And then there's a place where they're going to live, a geography. And traditional mission sense is not a problem. It's not bad. But we're going to go and we're going to say, okay, let's find an urban center and let's start categorizing down so that we can actually figure out where do these people live and how do we engage them, which is an access question, right?
right.
That's the traditional way to do it. Here's the people we want to reach. Let's find where they live. Let's go and engage them.
Yeah,
What I found as a super practical example is that we had a community in Oklahoma City that was a Habitat for Humanity built community. And it was for immigrants and refugees who had been here probably anywhere between 5 to 7 years, and that they had gotten out of the apartment life. They'd gotten established enough that they had good jobs, reasonable incomes, established families, established kind of cultural life, community life, and they were ready to make the jump into home ownership. And the Habitat of Humanity was a great way for them to do sweat equity as their down payment and then to get into that. Well,
right,
that Habitat for Humanity community was, I could walk into it. There were 37 unreached peoples in 78 houses when we found that community and began to engage it with prayer walking and backyard Bible clubs.
right,
Okay. We were able to connect with kids and we were able to connect with mothers all day long, all the time, as much as we wanted to. But we could not get those families to get identified and centered into a Christian community because we couldn't get the dads.
yeah,
And the reason we couldn't get the dads is because they were never home. And the reason they were never home is because they were always working.
right,
Here's the beauty of a story. We had someone who was working at a Hobby Lobby distribution plant that was able to share the gospel and lead to Christ. One of the dads of one of the families that we had been engaging, not specifically in that community, but because he was able to see that through the marketplace, now that family is going to be much more apt to moving. And the way in which that happened wasn't one or the other, it's the way of both. And that's a perfect example of how just a marketplace job cut across the sections and was able to grab the person that we couldn't get in the geographic location where they lived because they're spending the vast majority of their time working jobs in the marketplace. And that's where we've got to access.
it's so helpful the way you just told that story, Dave, because I do think it begins to cause light bulbs to go off for us, that we have so segmented out. The mission is over here, the thing that I do, and my job is what I do to fund my ability to go on this trip or to go over here and do this thing. It forces us back into seeing how strategic business is. Can you share even more just about how that's looked in your dry cleaning business, as you've seen that be a means of access and cutting through some of that rebar?
Yeah, there was at one time in our business where like I said, we spent 5 years focusing heavily in on unreached people groups. And so because of that, I always do a witness. You and I have talked about that a lot, where when you're doing a co-vocational multipliers kind of life, witness is really important, where you don't compartmentalize things, but you start to layer rhythms and habits on top of each other. And so because of that, because we were working within the international community a lot outside of the business and the job, I found that most of my networking, whenever I had a job opportunity come up where I needed to hire an employee, was coming out of the network where I was spending my time. And so I started to get a lot of internationals that worked for us. And at one point, we had 9 different languages spoken in our business of only 35 employees. Okay.
Yeah, it's
I'm not
incredible.
going to go off on the tangent of how complicated that became and
Yeah,
how much I need people to really take a good hard look and don't just dive into that with eyes blind. You need your eyes wide open if you decide to go that direction, okay? We'll leave
yes,
that at that point. But to
yes,
say that is to go, okay, in my business then, I had people from Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, the United States, and Canada that were working in my business.
yeah, yeah. It's exciting.
That's access, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's access.
and what I found was that the two things that are so crucial for gospel witness,
Yeah,
access and presence. And really, it comes down to this: you got to have time with people. So even if we were to follow a house of peace search method, where we were going to go in prayer walk, we were going to engage, we were going to get into a home. The reason we're going to go do that is because we're looking to be able to get into that home, to spend time with them, and to
so
be
good.
present with them
Yes,
while we're sharing the gospel and talking to them, so that the kingdom of God is not just a matter of words, but it's a matter of our very lives, as Paul would say. And
right.
what's interesting in the kingdom dynamic that happens inside of a business is that you get presence and you get time naturally in the regular rhythms of what's going on, because I was there, I was employing them, I was working with them, I was talking with them on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. So that phrase that our friend Guy, he often uses the phrase "redeeming the time," is it's an urban way of thinking, is what you're bringing up. I just want to highlight that for a second. There's so much of when we read through the Gospels or through the Book of Acts is in a context of rural, where people tend to, like you said, if you go and you're looking for that person of peace, like Jesus describes in Luke 10, or he models in John 4, where he meets this woman at the well. It's a village, even that context of John chapter 4, the whole village responds, is already connected relationally, and time is going to get there. But to your point, in an urban setting, people are pulled in so many different directions. The husband of the house is spending most of his time in the workplace and separate from everything else that's happening in his household. And so, if you're going to reach them and the husband is the bottleneck, you've got to have access. And business provides that. So, it's such a strategic way of saying, how do we find where people are already spending their time and redeem the time, make use of that time to see the gospel touch people in places that it would not otherwise.
And I think, Mark, whenever we want to redeem the time, one of the best ways to do that is to ask, who do I spend the most of my time with? Sometimes that's by choice, and sometimes that's not by choice.
Right.
So we have our social lives and our social calendars and our friends, and those are by choice. We have the freedom to choose when and where and how and who we relate with. And so we'll go out to dinner, we'll do that, but we have that choice. Whenever you go to work, you may like the people that you work with, you may not like the people that you work with, but it doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of people in the marketplace are working in a place that requires their time in the location where that they are. I mean, that's just how
Yes.
it goes. And so um redeeming the time not only means I need to pay attention to how to use my time best, but it also means look at the people who are in the time while you're around, and then start asking the questions, what can I do with that? Because I think one of the best ways to redeem gospel presence is to begin to look at where we spend the most time with people and start
Yes.
bringing the kingdom into those moments. And the workplace by far is, I mean, it is the place. And so you and I have talked here about the fact that dads or men in the homes are the ones that are doing most of the work in a in an unreached culture or a group that came from a maybe another country and moved in and has families. That's a very natural thing as well. But you also will find it where you'll have kids that will basically be raising themselves, where the money requires that the man and the woman both work. And we found homes where kids would come and play with us, and they wouldn't even have a mom or dad at home, and they weren't international kids. They were just American kids of whatever, ethnicity background that they came from, but their parents are having to work to make ends meet. And so, they're latchkey kids. They go home, they let themselves in after school, they go out and they play in the playground. Mom and dad may not be home until 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and one may be home while the other one works, and then vice versa. And so the parent might not, there always may be one parent at home, but the other one's always doing working at the opposite time. And
Yes.
so the idea of where are they spending their time, that's why we're talking about that, because that cross section of the rebar where we've got the ethnicities and the relational networks of our city that are connected through families, through ethnicities, through your people, places, and passions, where passions tend to go up and down the spectrum as well,
Yes.
because you'll have people from all the different stratas. And it's beautiful because the other thing that's really helpful is there really is a truth about the socioeconomic status of people, and
Yeah.
the receptivity to the gospel and the way in which they relate to people, for better or for worse, really is determined a lot by that socioeconomic status. The church will blow that apart and it'll bring them all together in a way that gospel peace can only do. But the reality is at the workplace, you've got that strata. And so having people in all levels of the marketplace, whether they're just the hourly worker all the way up to the manager, all the way up to the owner, business owner, all the way up to the CEO and everything in between, just allows us to cross that rebar over and over and over in places that otherwise we might not have access.
So, as we talk about this, Dave, there's one dynamic, and we've been bringing this up as a theme in our podcast to be able to see this stuff, to be able to see access is a key piece to begin to engage it. But then the next piece is, and I think I will bring this up in this episode. I was talking with Jim, who's on with us today, but talking about him this week, just about the idea that sometimes when we talk about a kingdom business, we're talking about a business that has kingdom values. That's a worthy thing to aim for, to run your business in a way that has great character. But what you're describing here, and again, it's people at different levels of participation in the business, whether they're the hourly worker or the owner. But what you're describing here is a kind of business that is not just a business that has kingdom values in the sense of I'm gonna run this business and trust God in him to provide and trust him in my business relationships and live in such a way that is honoring and holy before God. That's good. We should do that, right? But what your vision casting here is more than that. It's actually saying within the business, I'm going to leverage the customer relationships and the employee relationships, the supplier relationships. If you're part of a corporate structure, corporate relationships, different relationships within that as opportunities for sharing the gospel and making disciples. That's a different vision cast for the way that this cuts
Yeah.
across that urban rebar. Can you speak to that piece a little bit of not just access, but how that becomes a platform within the business?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's very important in the American Western context, especially where Christians have been taught that we're supposed to be quiet about our faith. And so, one of the main ways in which someone who is a believer who wants to honor the Lord tries to live out their faith in public is to be a person who lives rightly, a righteous person, a moral person,
Yeah.
a biblically grounded person. So they want to live that proverbial business. I want to do what's right because it's right. That's admirable and it's a given. Like if I'm going to be a believer, I need to
Yes.
run my business in a way that's of integrity, and I
Yeah.
need to have one that's of honesty, and I need to do it in a God honoring way. I think what we're getting at here is that we want to see the marketplace reached for Christ. That we've got to do word and deed. We've got to have, I call them the twin works, the work of my hands and the work of God's hands. And so we're doing the work of the kingdom, which is disciple making, as we live as a kingdom citizen, which is righteous living.
Yes.
And I don't see them as separate. I think that they're actually under the same banner. And I think one of the ways in which we have made it okay for us to do kingdom business in the sense of I'm doing I'm doing it with integrity and I'm doing it biblically as a Christian should,
Yes.
without being vocal about and open about the gospel of Jesus and our need to believe and repent that Jesus died, buried, rose from the dead, is because we think we're supposed to keep our religion, our
Mhm.
faith silent or quiet
Yeah.
in our culture. And I
Yeah.
think one of the breakout points that's really going to make a difference to where the marketplace becomes a true gospel access, where we see the Great Commission start to take root and get traction in the marketplace, is when we realize that the proclamation of the gospel and the demonstration of the gospel, not in terms of maybe the way it's used with miracles and those kind of things, but the actual demonstration of the gospel with my hands that I am a godly man, I'm going to do it right, or the work of my hands reflects just as much as the words of my mouth reflect. When you got to put those two things together and work. So it's a given. Are you a Christian? You ought to be righteous in the way in which you work,
Yeah.
integrity, morality, honesty. But you also need to open your mouth and say, "This is my Savior and why I do what I do," and be winsome and look for the opportunities to move conversations towards the gospel, because the real point is people.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that answer
I think it
what you were
answers it.
talking
Yeah,
about?
I think it's so rare. Like I meet people who think in terms of I want to be on mission and making disciples, and admirably they go after that and they're doing that. And then other folks that will say I want to be a good steward of my talents and do this in business. But it's rare to have the conversation. I think it's because we've compartmentalized out our thinking, especially in the West. But it's rare to have a conversation where we're saying how do we bring those twin works together so that you, Dave, as you're doing your work in dry cleaning, you're looking for those opportunities to hear and do, to proclaim and demonstrate as you're going about your day with all those different groups of people that you interact with in your business. And so it's about, I guess that's where I come again in this conversation. We've got to begin to see business and our work as access. And then we've got to begin to develop the skills to be able to live that out. And that's partly as we begin to end this out. That's why we do Kovo multipliers, Dave. Is we want to see people begin to have vision for where that's at in their life, in the passion, people, place, profession, and then to begin to develop the skills to be able to live that out as you go into the workplace, so that that amazing story that you're sharing about access to unreached people groups and people coming to faith in the Hobby Lobby warehouse, that happens if somebody can see it, but then they also have the skills to step into that moment with that man that they're working alongside of and lean in and begin to have the spiritual conversation, bring the gospel into it, and see them come to faith and become a disciple. So it's those two pieces coming together that I think is so crucial in talking about how business cuts across urban rebar. Anything else you want to share along those lines, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's super important for us as believers, whether I'm an employee, whether I'm a business owner, or whether I'm working a job and then doing ministry outside of that, which are kind of some of the ways in which we think about the role of how Covo multipliers or Covo life works. I want to be Christ-like, but I also want to talk about my Christ, right?
Yes. Right.
And so they're not separate. They don't have to be separate. And I think that if we can get a vision for what it looks like to live like a kingdom citizen while we talk about our King, to live Christ likeness while we talk about our Christ, however you want to word it, the demonstration of it, the proclamation of it. There's a lot of different quips and ways that we could say that. But it's
Right.
just about integrating all of our life under the lordship of Jesus. It really is just about saying where I live, where I work, where I play is now under the umbrella in Christ, and I'm just going to be there and live as a kingdom citizen would for him, underneath the banner, all of that. And when we get that idea and we couple it with that urban rebar that we started off with, then all of a sudden the strategic clarity of how we begin to access the ethnicities and the segments of our society while we go across the sections in the marketplace don't have to become just strategy. They become just a way for us to view how important living Christ likeness and proclaiming our Christ is in our everyday lives. And it helps us to go, I'm not just out here wandering, I'm strategic for what God wants to do in this city.
Dude, I think you just landed the plane right there. I think that's it. That's the vision cast that we hope that those that will listen to this, watching with us today on Substack, begin to catch. Is really, it's first of all just those eyes to begin to see where you already are, and then I just want to invite you guys as we finish out here to join us for our next lab. We do 45-minute labs once a month on third Wednesdays. Next one is May 20th, if I'm right, Dave. And the topic is, how do you go from lost to leader? So as we're engaging with, to use your story, the guy that's next to you in the Hobby Lobby warehouse, or that client, somebody across the counter, wherever it is in your life, how do you begin to see that person go from lost to coming into the kingdom, and then even becoming a leader to others around them in the kingdom? We're going to unpack what that can look like in our next lab. So we'll put the link in the description that you can sign up for that lab. So, Dave, this has been really helpful today. Thanks for letting me interview you around this topic.
Yeah, hopefully this urban rebar and this Christ likeness and sharing Christ in your workplace kind of meld together, and you guys really grab a hold of this. Hope it helps.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.